90 minutes for this next block to hear views, opinions, and recommendations from the Fond du Lac Band. So I'll recognize Miss Vanessa Ray Hodge to open and to call witnesses, and we'll cycle through the witnesses and presentations with our assistants here.
Good morning. The first witness for the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, will be Thomas Howes. The last name is spelled Howes, and he is the Natural Resources Program Manager for the Fond du Lac Band.
All right, bonjour and dinaway magani dug. Hello everyone, all my relatives. Vilket är du dem? Mer ma på pass community gång är skana geding wen jabayan. Ni bedasage guyan. Nano abanuji gandaya. Gamin and ungwa gonna wen gay one in the no key. So my government name is Thomas Howes. And I am the Natural Resource Manager for the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. I'm also a tribal member there. And what I said to you is that I'm Eagle Clan. I'm from this reservation, from this place of the Bald Island. I'm the lightning that comes before the storm. I represent my 5 children, and I work to take care of the gifts that were given to us to take care of. And that's what I want to spend my time talking to you about today. So, really what I want to highlight with you guys is, one, I work in this, what we call our resource management division. But I also want to talk to you about what it is to be a tribal member, what it is to live this way of life, and I want to sort of highlight that for you. And what we do in our resource management division to care for our way of life, and what projects like PolyMet, what they imperil in its current form as proposed. So this is our formal mission statement in English. Our division consists of everything from conservation enforcement, forestry and fisheries and wildlife experts, environmental, cultural resources protection, and the list continues to grow as we add things like invasive species programs, etc. But essentially everything to do our part to care for the natural resources under our jurisdiction, which is the Fond du Lac Reservation and all of our treaty ceded territory areas. And that's something that I want to kind of jump into next. Here at Fond du Lac, along with a lot of our other Ojibwe relatives, we were signatory to treaties over time, cessions of land to the United States. And that really drives why we're here and why we do what we do. If you look at 1837, that ceded territory area, altogether that and the other two, the 1842 and 1854, it's about 30 million acres. The reason that's important is that all of those treaties have similar language in that we agreed with the United States. We made a relationship. And we said, we're going to sell you this land as much as we hate to. We know that we need to. But we're going to retain some property rights, some usufructuary rights, you may hear me say. So if you hear me say ceded territories throughout my talk, to me this is normal language. To other people may or not be normal, but that's what I'm referring to as these territories. But when we made these agreements with the United States, in our hearts, the way we do things as Ojibwe people is we're calling in our whole existence prior to us to help us. So when we sat down with the United States, if you go back and look at the records of it, we insisted that there was pipe ceremony as part of that. Because in those ceremonies, we call in all of our ancestors, all the representative spirits of all these different, what people today call resources, what we think of more in the philosophy of gifts or our relatives. And so that informs our decision making and part of the reason we're here today. So when we dial into why we're here today, we're talking about what some people call the Arrowhead region of Minnesota and what we call the 1854 ceded territory. This one's important because it establishes the Fond du Lac Reservation as well as many other reservations throughout the Great Lakes region. But it's also important to this because of the project is within the ceded territories and within this watershed that is noted here, the St. Louis River watershed. The reason this slide is similar, but I'm putting it up here so that you will note the extent of mining that has already gone on and impairment that already is in place in this watershed. And obviously this project proposes to kind of reuse or recycle some of that. This here in particular is where the proposed infrastructure is and some of its land exchanges. So again, just kind of giving us all the same sort of place that we're talking about. Whoop. And the reason that some of this is important and why we're here is, again, as most people are aware, in that watershed and from where those proposed discharges are, they flow down what we call Chippewa or St. Louis River in modern vernacular or common understanding. But the lake that flows to the Great Ojibwe Sea, or to Lake Superior, as some people call it. It also forms our northern and eastern boundary of the reservation, and that's why our water quality standards are called into this discussion. And the sort of second half of that slide is again, where the project proposed is, and how it's hydrologically connected to us. So that's now we have sort of the sense of where we are and who we are a little bit. I wanted to just sort of to talk about this, and I'm going to talk back and forth as an individual, as a tribal member, as a hunter, as a fisherman, as a rice maker, as a woodworker, as a father, as an uncle, as a cousin, and that's how I approach what I do. It's very hard to separate being an individual human being from my work. It's all the same. It's a basket. It's all woven together. So that's kind of how I'm going to present things to you here today. And what this is Chippewa or the St. Louis River. The slide on your left is along the Fond du Lac Reservation. In our place we call it Shkibwakoning, or the place of the artichokes, or what some people call Brookston. But it's one of my favorite places on the river. And this is the place, this river is where I learned to fish. As a young boy, would walk down from Reservation Road and fish there. And so aside from my connection to it, the Fond du Lac Band's connection to this river and a lot of people's connection throughout Minnesota and expansion is through this river. The Ojibwe people came across the Great Lakes, and the navigational route for all westward expansion, fur trade, everything, that there were no roads. These were the highways, was this river. And part of that river network is what you see there on the right, is a place we go Gitchigakabikong, or the place of a lot of falls. It's today called Jay Cook State Park. But what that was part of that path up here to where you are today. So you take Lake Superior, you go through what's called the St. Louis River estuary to the bottom of a rapids, and then you would have to portage around Gitchigakabikong, and you get up to this village. This is one of our 7 villages that we've historically utilized. So our history is tied to these ceded territories, but especially for us as a band to this river. And so you would portage up here, and when we signed treaties, we decided that we'd keep this village up here on the river where our rice lakes are. Or this is what we were able to hang on to, because I would have, if I was there, I would have wanted to stay by Lake Superior, but this is where we ended up, and this is a beautiful place. And that's why we fight for it, because it's the only thing that we have left. And so that just gives you a sense of a little bit of our connection to this place. That's Nokomis Aban, Minawa Nimishon Misaban. These are my grandparents. They're the reason that I'm here. And literally, this is supposed to be a representation to you that we have connections to the past, but also an obligation forward. And that is the lens through which we see our work. It's the lens through which I approach my work. But it also shows how even back in the 50s, when our treaty rights weren't acknowledged or recognized, people were still utilizing them, and that we had to fight for a very long time to get those acknowledged. We've had to litigate, and we've spent millions on resource work to protect those rights. And that's where we are, is in this phase where we've gone through the 90s and the early 2000s to have our treaty rights recognized by the United States and the states. And now we're in the phase where we're trying to ensure that those are there for our grandchildren. Because this isn't about hunting or fishing or gathering in a recreational way. This is about subsistence. This is about food. This is about medicine. This is about a way of life. When we were signing treaties, it got written down in English as hunting, fishing, gathering, or some version of that, and depending on which treaty you're looking at. But the best understanding we have, because we all spoke Ojibwe at the time these treaties were negotiated. The old people are believed to have said that we want to hang on to Wenji Bamadizion, or those things that give us life. That's what we want to. We said, yes, we'll sell you the land, but we want to have those things still that give us life. So these are the things that give us life. These are the foods that give us life. And that's a little bit of kind of what I want to highlight here. This is literally the composition of my youngest daughter's first solid meal. And these are all these gifts from the land, from our ceded territories, and from on the reservation. And so this is manoman, or wild rice, minan, blueberries, and jiwagamizagan, or syrup. But these are all food. They're not only food, they're preventative medicine. They are the best thing for us as humans. If I had this, if I only ate that stuff, I'd be even leaner than I am. And I would live a lot longer time. People would live to be 120 very routinely if you live a subsistence lifestyle. And so that's what we're about as a people. That's what I'm about as a person, is as food, as medicine, but food and wellness in many ways, beyond our physical. We've been disconnected from many things over the course of our interaction with the United States, and we're just trying to reclaim and rebuild these things so that we can be as strong as we can possibly be. Because life is hard. And so we respect all of the things that have fed our people over time. We have a relationship with them that is what I explain to people, akin to a life debt. So all those things, those things that give us life, have fed us and made it possible for me to speak to you today. And in return, I have a debt back to them, to the fish, to the trees, to the plants, to Manoman, etc. I have a responsibility to speak for them when they can't, because they gave me the ability to speak. So that's why I'm here. And so I think I said it before, but this isn't about recreational harvest. This is about feeding our families. This is about making sure that intergenerational transmission of cultural knowledge continues. Because this is what feeds absolutely everything we do. It's about community, and it's about healthy food. So as I said, we spend a lot of time and effort to ensure that these things continue to exist, whether that's law enforcement or personal safety of the people from accidents or from other people harassing them. That's what we have to do. Right now, this is going on in our ceded territories. We're doing our spring harvest of fisheries. Hundreds of people will be fed, tons of ceremonies from the time we're children to the time that we pass on, and to the ones that we memorialize our ancestors that have gone on will be taken care of through these gifts. And so these are just to show you that this isn't a catch and release scenario. This is a catch and eat scenario. And it's, you know, all parts of the systems. And we study the forests and take care of them because they take care of us. Doing things like prescribed burning and wildfire prevention so that our communities are safe and also fed. Because all parts of the forest have different uses to us at different times. We just finished this season of our sugar making seasons. Again, because this is something that is always taking care of us, and that's why we do that. So that we have gifts, so that we have food, so that we have that medicine. We spend quite a bit of time, because we live here and where it's cold, trying to stay warm and trying to stay well fed with proteins. But as an agency, we also spend an awful lot of time making sure that everything we do is sustainable. These harvests aren't without engagement and partnership with state and federal partners. We're trying to make sure that everything we do is absolutely responsible so that our grandchildren enjoy better than what we have. And sometimes that's a challenge. You know, sometimes there are climate impacts, and there are other impacts, conflicts between species. And so there's things like the moose that we spend a lot of time doing research and study on, and that's in partnership with states and federal agencies. But we're also doing things like thinking ahead. And that's a lot of what the next section of my slides is about about thinking ahead. And so one of the things that we're thinking ahead about is the elk, and trying to have populations that used to exist here be brought back. We're trying to restore that and honor that relationship that they fed our people in the past, and they've been extirpated from this part of the state and part of the country. So we're trying to bring them back and honor that relationship, and also continue to be able to feed our people. But it's not always about food. It's also about imperiled species, endangered and threatened species. And that for cultural reasons and those kinds of things, we will study and protect species that, even though we're not going to consume them, but they have a place in the order of creation that should be respected and protected as well. So we have a lot of collaboration with the state of Minnesota on their wolf population modeling, because it's important to make sure that these guys continue to exist as a species. And this is supposed to have, get it to all go. There's sound to it, but I think we all know what a river sounds like. Just for scale, those are 6-foot fish. And what that is something I really, it's near to my heart, but because it's a project that I work on a lot. But it's one of an example of, again, the band thinking ahead and honoring a relationship, and planning ahead for the future. And this is a project the band itself completely initiated in the mid-90s. Is a sturgeon reintroduction program on Chigamaziba, or the St. Louis River, up here along the reservation above some hydro dams that separate us from Lake Superior. And this was an intentional effort to reestablish a species that was considered extirpated in the St. Louis River because of numerous ways that it was degraded, overfished, its habitat altered, log drives through the river, etc. But they were considered extirpated up here. And so in the mid 90s, we began study and actually initiated stocking in 1998. And that's what that slide prior of the video is. Those are the parents of these fish. And so we have to work really hard to get this done. There are two stable populations of lake sturgeon in the Lake Superior Basin where we can get genetics from, that have enough spare genetics. That's how bad of shape this species is in. But as Ojibwe people in the along this river, our village where I live now is this place called Nagachuanong near Duluth. It's the name Fond du Lac. It's at the base of that portage I talked about earlier. That's where our annual fish camps were. So the walleye would run right this time of year, and the water warms another 5 degrees, and the maywug or sturgeon run up the river and spawn there. And then in the fall, a whitefish would run there. And those were the three species that really sustained our community. And so to honor that relationship, now that we're here up at this upper village where they've been extirpated, we're trying to bring them back. And so we have to travel all the way to the Sturgeon River, where the Keweenaw Bay Indian community nearby their community, near Baraga, Michigan, to get these parents. And so we'll go and live capture some adults, borrow a small percentage of their genetics, and working in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service, hatch them out, and then eventually transport them, bring them back home. And we're bringing them up here to the St. Louis River. And we've been doing this in waves, like I said, since 1998. Because we're trying to rebuild the connection to our community with these. And we're using a lot of different ways. And so it's, more modern techniques like pump trucks. We started out with just coolers of fish and some handcrafted things that had their own nicknames, to bubbler jars, just to get them here safely. But this has been successful. This is a live capture of an adult for tagging purposes. And so this is an ongoing part of it, is we're still continuing to stock so we have the right amount of genetic diversity, but we're also capturing them now because they're of reproductive age. Lake sturgeon take about 20 years to become reproductive. And so the fish that we initially stocked are now of reproductive age, and we want to see where in the 120 some miles of free-flowing river up here they are doing that activity. Because we want to, document their actual reproduction in the river, but in a high tannin river, it's a challenge. And so we're adding radio tags to help us pinpoint locations and also sort of show the success, the growth rate, et cetera, of this effort. So that's just a little bit about that, because those are what we intend. We don't harvest them right now. They're protected as a species because there's not enough either known about how successful they are, but also how many there are. So we're saving those for our grandkids. This is, you're probably well aware if you've ever met an Ojibwe, is one of this plants nation that's of utmost importance to us. This is Menomin, or some people call it a rice, but it's something that's unique to this part of the world that is, again, responsible for us as a people, and especially in our culture, to have survived through very challenging history. We actually thrived in this region because of this plant, and we've survived since then because of it. And that's why we advocate so strongly to protect it, because one, it's the only place in the world that this species, just from a biological level, exists, but two, because it's fed us as a people, and it's interwoven into everything that we do and who we are. This is from the headwaters of the St. Louis River, up near where this project is proposed. But also this species is throughout the watershed here on the reservation as well. This is one of our lakes on the reservation that we routinely harvest from. And it's a focal point for our community. The harvest season is extremely important. Just to show you, give you an idea of how important it is. We've spent millions over the last couple of years, or a couple decades, I should say, restoring damages to watersheds, converting plant communities back to dominance by monomen, from ill-informed decisions about land use, channelization, dredging, ditching, wetland fill, etc. And so we take our responsibility to this plant just as serious as all those others. You know, and this involves installing water control structures and managing water level in a way that's more historically representative of where those lakes and things should be, but also doing things like managing beaver populations and removing obstructions so that conditions exist that are favorable. And then going down the watershed to near Lake Superior, this is down in one of the areas of concern in the Great Lakes that we're trying to do our part to get it delisted. And by restoring habitat and reintroducing habitat function and species richness down there, we're in our ceded territories living out our obligation and bringing wild rice back down there in partnership with the different state agencies and to bring this back to our old village areas. And this is our staff reseeding this rice back down there. This is something we've been doing for the past 6 years. And I want to delve into the chemistry and all that, and I'll leave that for other folks to talk about. But just to say that our interest in this goes into and being early adopters and advocates for better understanding and science around contamination and threats to monomen. That's how just another part of our responsibility is to look at it from as many angles as possible. Because we know from some of the work that we do, whether it's from a sediment core near other poorly made decisions about discharge, you can see sulfur wipe out whole lakes. So these things are the reason that I'm here. It's not just about what we as people want, but our responsibility to our relatives, whether they're the fish or future generations. I'm here because I'm trying to advocate for the United States to live up to its obligations to us as a people, to honor their treaty obligations, to honor their trust responsibility. I'm here because some of those of our relatives can't speak for themselves, whether they're the plant nation or the fish, but also the old people that can't be here, the people that came before me that didn't have their voices heard, or the ones that have not yet to even be born. I'm here to basically make sure that these kinds of things continue. I have to imagine that it was very hard for my ancestors to make a treaty with the United States and give up territory. A time in history that was probably very challenging to them, and they probably saw that as very, very challenging, and yet they still managed to think ahead. And I think we're still at those kinds of decision points, and we still need to think ahead so that this way of life continues. And I would just encourage the Corps to live up to its responsibilities in the United States, to do its duty to ensure that the band and its rights are acknowledged and respected. With that, I thank you for listening to me, Miigwech Bizendawieg. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Tom, for that great presentation. Before I introduce the band's next witness, I also just want to let everyone know and recognize the Reservation Business Committee, who is here with the chairman today. We have Secretary Treasurer Ferdinand Martineau, District 1 Representative Wally Dupuis, District 2 Representative Bruce Savage, and District 3 Representative Roger Smith. It is through the RBC's leadership and dedication and perseverance that we are here today. And I also want to recognize the band's in-house legal counsel, Tribal Attorney Sean Copeland, Tribal Attorney Allie Jo Mitchell, and also my partner and colleague at Sonosky, Matthew Murdoch. The band's next witness is Nancy Schultz. She is the Water Projects Coordinator for the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa.
Bonjour. It's an unexpected yet long-awaited opportunity to be able to meet with the Corps today. Thank you, Colonel Jansen, and thank EPA as well for listening to our concerns and examining the work that we had done and sharing their conclusions and recommendations with us in advance of our comments today. So Tom really set the stage very well, but I always like to begin my comments when I speak about the work that I do for the Fond du Lac Band with maps. It's so important to have that knowledge and sense of place. And as Tom explained to you from his perspective as a band member and as a person who exercises treaty rights and has grown up in this area, my comments will focus, as his did, around the St. Louis River watershed and our reservation lands that are within the watershed, as well as the 1854 ceded territory. This all represents Fond du Lac homelands, and it is what we all strive to work for. I've been a staff member since 1997. I was hired by the band to develop water quality standards that were ultimately approved by EPA. And that was 25 years ago. And it is maybe one of the most important investments that the band made in being able to prepare for the future and to be able to protect our resources. There's fewer than 50 tribes nationwide out of over 570 recognized tribes that have gone that distance to have approval for treatment as a state, and then to develop water quality standards that are federally approved and implemented. And again, the hydrologic connection is going to be the crux of my comments, because our water quality authorities under the Clean Water Act pertain to waters of the reservation, but the St. Louis River forms over 20 miles of reservation boundary. We share jurisdiction for these waters with the state of Minnesota and the state of Wisconsin, and obviously the Clean Water Act authorities that federal agencies like the Corps and EPA have. So for the work that I do and was originally hired to do on reservation, it's all about the waters of the reservation, the lakes, the streams, the wetlands, and the St. Louis River, to which our authorities apply. We have implemented our treaty rights through a robust monitoring program, through 401 certifications that are issued, always with conditions. And the off-reservation part of my job has evolved as we began to realize that some of the problems that we were seeing through our monitoring program certainly did not originate on the reservation, but rather were coming to us from upstream sources. So the Clean Water Act provides for opportunities for the band or for a state to look at what is happening outside of their boundaries, outside of their jurisdiction. And there are certain frameworks where there is an opportunity to be able to weigh in and explain and defend your perspectives around what the impacts might be if an action were to be permitted to go forward that would originate outside the reservation, yet impact reservation waters. And so for those off-reservation issues, we really do rely upon our relationship with the federal government, with the US EPA primarily, but also with the Corps and with the Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Interior, with other agencies that also have that trust responsibility with the band and understand that the protection of treaty resources is central to that trust responsibility. I mentioned our water quality standards. I was hired, as I said, after the decision had already been made by the Tribal Council to pursue TAS, treatment as an affected state. And that TAS had been approved the year prior to my being hired. And water quality standards were already in draft form, but I worked closely with my colleagues at the Resource Management Division, with the community at large, and with the tribal leadership to establish the same elements in our water quality standards that form the standards for states and those federal standards that EPA implements. We have tribally specific designated uses that include such things as wild rice, cultural resources, aesthetic resources. We have established numeric and narrative criteria, both, that are intended to protect our water resources so that they can continue to support and provide the kinds of resources that our community relies upon for subsistence. So it isn't just about a basement level of protection. It's about protecting the qualities and the condition that allow for diversity, for healthy, highly functional ecosystems. We also really focus on anti-degradation. We have high-quality waters on the reservation, and we intend to protect them at that high level of function and that high condition and quality through our anti-degradation provisions. All of the waters of the reservation are considered at least Tier 2 or exceptional use waters. Our wild rice waters are considered Tier 3, where we would not permit any degree of degradation to occur. In fact, what we have seen over 20 plus years of monitoring is that really the only impairment that needs to be addressed for waters of the reservation is mercury. And we have problems with mercury in both the concentrations measured in the water and the concentrations measured in fish tissue. But these water quality standards, as was so profoundly explained to me by tribal leaders and by my managers at the time of my hire, was that this was maybe one of the most fundamental ways that the band could exercise its sovereignty in a modern world to maximize the ability to protect these important resources. And as I said, we've developed a monitoring program and have been implementing that since 1998. We're looking at physical, chemical, biological measures. We understand our waters and the biological communities that they support. We've been collecting data long enough that we're in a position now to begin doing some of this deep dive to be able to discern trends, including climate change impacts. And as far as water quality trends, we see that we're holding stable with the exception of mercury. And with the exception of the specific conductance criterion that I will speak about shortly, that seems to be an increasing problem. And then, of course, we are already experiencing some of the hydrologic changes that climate change is wreaking in this region. But that does also inform the development of new standards. So when I talk about our awareness of upstream impacts to our reservation waters, it wasn't until I'd been working for the band for about 6 or 7 years that Tom and I became involved in a multi-agency biological assessment of the entire St. Louis River watershed upstream of the area of concern. Back in 2005, I think it was, Tom and I spent many, many days on the river, all the way up at the headwaters outside of Seven Beavers Lake, all the way through the Mesabi Range and down past Floodwood and the reservation. And we were essentially replicating a massive bioassessment that the DNR had done back in the 40s and then again in the 70s. And it was intended to be able to track the condition of the fisheries. And we also brought a new component of habitat assessment, water chemistry measurements, and looking at the benthic invertebrate community to understand the condition of this river. And it was about that time that there was a boom and an expansion in the existing taconite industry. If you look at the headwaters of this, in this figure, you see that the St. Louis River meets the Rainy River watershed and the Mississippi River watershed at a single point that actually lies on the property controlled by Hibbing taconite, the Hill of Three Waters. So a major continental divide lies along the Mesabi Iron Range. And it has been heavily mined for the past 150 years. High-grade iron ore, and then as that was mined out, there were new technologies developed to be able to go after the lower-grade taconite ore. Obviously, a lot more waste involved with that, and so the result of over 150 years of mining across the Mesabi Iron Range is that almost the entire 110-mile length of it is covered with waste rock stockpiles, mine pits and shafts, tailings basins and mining facilities and all the infrastructure that ties it together. It has been a massive and permanent footprint on the land and in the headwaters of the St. Louis River. And understanding that impact, this is a figure that I borrowed from Michael Croteau, a hydrologist that used to work for the DNR with the Forest Service now. He mapped a lot of the existing mining features and did a GIS analysis of where those impacts have occurred across those three major watersheds. And about 50% of the wetland impacts and the headwaters burial, et cetera, has occurred in the St. Louis River watershed upstream of the reservation. So when I get to talking about cumulative impacts, I want to stress and reinforce the fact that the cumulative impacts that the band is concerned about don't just originate with the PolyMet project. It was about that time, as I said, that we were beginning to be aware of a number of expansions at these existing taconite mines. I knew very little bit about mining and mining processing and how it could impact water resources. But we were able to connect with supporting staff at GLFWC, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the other bands that share treaty resource rights in the 1854, Grand Portage and Bois Forte, and the 1854 Treaty Authority. So when I talk about we and our work on mining review and permitting review, it includes the work that we did as a team of tribal scientists and tribal staff members to understand the existing and potential future impacts of mining on the resources in this watershed. So we began to review EISs, the air quality, water quality permits, and engaging and requesting consultation, often with the Corps, because usually there was a relatively large wetland permit associated with these expansions, extensions, progressions of existing facilities. And so under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, we would request consultation. And we began to have this dialogue over and over again about natural resources as cultural resources. And we weren't just concerned about protecting the remnants of a rice camp or the physical feature of the Mesabi Wiju, the Mesabi Iron Range, and its significance, but also about all of those resources that Tom kind of laid the table with you about that comprise the cultural identity and the cultural and spiritual and physical health of the Ojibwe people. We really needed to educate ourselves on the mining process and what was and was not being examined in the environmental review of these projects. And right away, we were calling attention to problems that we saw, that in fact, these were already impaired waters. The entire watershed is impaired for, at least for mercury in fish or in the water column, or both. And the impacts that have already occurred, the alteration of hydrology, et cetera, so many thousands of acres of wetlands that have been permanently erased from the landscape and the functions that they provided. And the loss of access to treaty resources everywhere that this footprint has left its mark. There's been an erosion of the resources, the quality of the resources, access to the resources. The kinds of wetlands that have been impacted are really generally high quality boreal forested wetlands, peat bogs. There's so much diversity in these systems. There are so many functions. They capture and sequester carbon at a higher rate than just about any other ecosystem on the planet besides the ocean. They provide foods and medicines. They're habitat for other important species. And once they're gone, they're gone. You don't just grow another peat bog or a forested wetland out of a cornfield, which is what we were seeing in terms of mitigation for the Army Corps permits that were being issued for 300, 400, 500 acres of impact at a time, from the entire progression of projects from the western edge of the Iron Range all the way to North Shore and the eastern edge. If there was wetland mitigation, it was out of the watershed, out of the ceded territories, and completely out of kind. Permanent, complete loss to the band. We noticed that there were already impacts to wild rice waters. Our poster child are the Twin Lakes outside of the Mintac Tailings Basin. One of the first projects that we reviewed, and where we came to understand for the first time that the state agencies that we assumed were enforcing the regulations that are on the books and have been on the books for decades to protect wild rice, that was not happening. And it wasn't because the DNR and the MPCA didn't realize there were wild rice resources up there or that high sulfate could be a problem. They just looked the other way and went ahead and permitted these expansions and these extensions and these progressions, did not require the industry to treat their waste. And so there are wild rice waters that are now mine pits. There are former wild rice waters that no longer support wild rice because They've been loaded with sulfate for decades. This kind of heavy, intensive industrial earth moving unleashes a lot of minerals and ions from the landscape. And once it's in the water, highly soluble, you end up with really high concentrations in mine pits, in the leachate coming out of waste rock stockpiles, certainly coming out of tailings basins. And these are unlined, and they are impacting the waters, the receiving waters nearby. And so we know from the research that we have helped to support for over 15 years now. We have seen the scientific evidence that demonstrates not only a confirmation that sulfate loading is toxic to wild rice, but how it is toxic to wild rice. It's when it is reduced to sulfide in the anaerobic sediments of wild rice waters that it is highly toxic, and at a very specific point of the life cycle of the wild rice plant. Our ongoing experiments that have continued for the last 10 years since the state was going through its rulemaking have really been able to shed a lot of light on our knowledge about how sulfate affects wild rice. We know that it can increase methylation of mercury that is deposited in these waters and in these watersheds. Sulfate-reducing bacteria can use that sulfate as an energy source, and a byproduct is methylmercury. And so our watersheds up here are really, really efficient at methylating mercury, and you'll hear more about that from others today. It contributes to the observed aquatic toxicity that the state of Minnesota has seen in some of its impaired waters and the waters that have been listed on their 303D list. It can contribute to eutrophication. There's a number of lakes up along the Iron Range that are getting a load of sulfate out of these existing mines, and it is contributing to some pretty drastic impairments. And it's even been associated with the pitting and the corrosion of the steel piers and infrastructure in the harbor. So this is a picture of an engineered seep at the toe of a tailings basin where you can see the water pooling. And off in the distance, you can see my cursor up there, that's the Twin Lakes outside of the Mintac tailings basin. So you can see the distance as the crow flies is about a mile at most, but that seepage that has been designed here to discharge through this wetland and make its way over to that lake over the course of the last 40 years has completely wiped out a wild rice population that Grand Portage and Bois Forte tribal members were harvesting a generation ago. And not only does it wipe out the wild rice, but that seepage, the hydrologic impact itself, causes conversion. You probably saw in the distance, you know, there's a nice spruce tamarack bog here. Well, it's also altered the hydrology to the extent that it's completely converted the wetland type. And so you've lost that forested wetland component, and you've got a nice cattail monoculture stretching all the way from the tailings basin to the wild rice that no longer supports wild rice. You can see that it plays a role in the phosphorus release from the sediments, and you can see some algal scum developing in that pool. The mercury in fish, again, a lot of the problems that we are seeing with the mercury in fish in our reservation waters, in our ceded territory waters, originates and is exacerbated by the mining industry. And so from the headwaters all the way past the reservation, all the way down to the area of concern, the estuary, where it meets Lake Superior, there's a relatively strict fish consumption advisory in place by the state. And of course, we're doing our own fish consumption advisories doing our best to balance the need for encouraging the practice of traditional life ways with the knowledge that you simply can't eat very many of the fish that you can catch out of these waters because of the neurological and other physical impacts. Again, we've tried to be sensitive as to how we communicate this information, encouraging eating the size of fish, the species of fish, at a frequency that is safe and healthy. But that's walking a really fine tightrope, and it is not a solution. A solution would be getting the mercury down and getting the sulfate down. Some of the data that we have collected, that's interesting. Just to give you an idea, this is just a few seasons of mercury data from 5 of our permanent monitoring sites on the St. Louis River. And you can see the GLI standard, the Great Lakes Initiative standard of 1.3 nanograms per liter, is almost always exceeded. This is our standard, which was calculated assuming a fish consumption rate that is double that of the general population, which is where the GLI standard was pegged. And so you can see that the St. Louis River from this data set is exceeding our mercury standard almost always. Another way of demonstrating that here, this is a little broader data set. The lower purple line is actually the method detection limit, and then this blue turquoise line is, again, our criterion. And you can see that over the years at the different sites, we're almost always exceeding our water quality standard for mercury. And in the work that I've done with the around the basin with the Lake Superior, first it was the binational program, now the partnership, the work group, one of the things that we do is track the sources of these bioaccumulative contaminants of concern, including mercury and their sources. And over time, as other sources of mercury emissions have been able to bring them down under control, the portion that the taconite industry represents has become a much larger piece of the pie, to the extent that they are far and away the largest source of mercury emissions in the Lake Superior Basin, in fact, in the entire upper Midwest. So that mercury problem affects not only our on-reservation fishing, with the St. Louis River being our most important on-reservation fishery resource, but also the treaty fishing that is done. And it's going on, as Tom said, right now, this time of the year. So wild rice and mercury, obviously, these are things that we have expressed concern about over and over again, understandably, but it is more than just the fish and the rice. It is all of the other gifts that this landscape provides, the materials, the maple sugar, the medicines that are at risk, the wildlife, the unique wildlife that this kind of an ecosystem supports when it's healthy and functional and intact. We're seeing diminished resources that have been important over many, many generations to the band, and it's from a host of stressors, not only due to mining, but certainly on top of climate change and disease and other issues that our scientists are looking at. Every stressor compounds the problem. It was during the draft EIS for PolyMet that we became aware of a study that the Minnesota DNR had commissioned, looking at what habitat remained across the Mesabi Iron Range that was still intact, that was not a mining feature. And at that time, there were, I think, 16 places across the entire 110-mile stretch of the Mesabi Iron Range that still had relatively intact habitat, where there could be migration, there could be populations moving back and forth. And it isn't just the big animals, it isn't just the moose and the deer, it's other animals that rely upon intact habitat to be able to move around. This essentially becomes the Great Wall of China for wood turtles or for other smaller animals once all of those green spaces are closed up. So what we learned, we tribal staff working together, is that mining has a really distinct fingerprint in terms of what it does to water quality. We see elevated dissolved constituents contributing to specific conductance, or total hardness is another measure where it's often really apparent. These are naturally really soft waters with very little solutes in them. Really soft waters, really low in sulfate, but once they come in contact with the mine processing or mining features, they're elevated. There are process chemicals, there are minerals and other ions that are released. We're seeing evidence that some of these concentrations are above the regulatory standards, including mercury, that can be released from disturbed peatlands just from the actual disruption of the landscape. Wild rice has been diminished or outright destroyed, and the biological communities that we rely upon have become impaired or unbalanced. They're missing sensitive species. They no longer support the diversity that they once did. And we've wondered early on, how far downstream did those impacts propagate? And so eventually we did begin to examine that. The mining footprint is something that I alluded to earlier. It's a really heavy and permanent change to this landscape. Thousands of acres of wetlands have been filled or dredged. The hydrology has been completely modified. We've worked with the USGS to develop a model of what mining has done to change the groundwater flow patterns across the headwaters of the St. Louis River, and what it has done to diminish existing wetland features. And it's a profound change. We have headwaters that have been buried and changes throughout the watershed. These lakes, natural lakes and mine pits are being used sometimes as tailings dumps. There's been a massive interbasin transfer of water from groundwater being pumped and then discharged into a different watershed, which we've called into question about being consistent with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And traditional cultural properties, things like rice camps, sugar bush, hunting grounds, sacred places, trails, etc., have been degraded or destroyed. And these impacts are permanent. They're a permanent loss. The altered hydrology I mentioned, it can change things in both direction, where you have excess flow through a system, or you have entire watersheds being pirated of their water at the headwaters. Changes groundwater, it changes base flow in streams and rivers. And then maybe most importantly, we were beginning to get a sense that none of these projects were adequately addressing the cumulative effects of what this amount of mining across time has done to this watershed and to the ceded territories. The cumulative effects analysis that was going on for any of these environmental reviews was so narrowly constrained to a very small area, maybe the actual footprint of the proposed action. And nobody was looking at the big picture and taking it into context and understanding that it was a cumulative impact to treaty resources for the band, and one that was not being addressed in any fashion or any kind of mitigation or even being recognized. And we also began to recognize that, and it wasn't just from our own monitoring, but from studies that were being done by, for instance, the state DNR or the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's monitoring, is that these violations of the band's water quality standards on our reservation were coming from existing impacts of permitted mining facilities. And so all of that flows downstream, that hydrologic connection from the reservation upstream to downstream. And we began to look for help. We asked EPA Region 5 to provide some technical and financial support so that we could learn what we needed to learn and understand what to review and how to review and what kind of comments we could make in this environmental review process that could gain traction and maybe make a difference in the way a project unfolded. We were able to actually access some specialized training in hydrology and hydrologic modeling, in understanding financial assurance, because as the PolyMet project began, was announced with their intent to move forward, and they were going through the preliminary process and the scoping process for the EIS, we recognized that we were going to have to really step up our game and pay close attention to every step of the process, because if taconite, which everybody considers this relatively benign kind of hard rock mining that doesn't release toxic chemicals, and that the state of Minnesota was so vigorously enforcing its regulatory framework around, if we were seeing the results of that, we could only imagine what the potential results would be if the next big mining project was a sulfide ore body, because we would get all of those other impacts plus a much more toxic water discharge. And the scale of this project in terms of the amount of wetland impacts was a little bit breathtaking. So again, we asked for help. One of the things that EPA provided for us was some contractor support to develop a protocol for conducting a cumulative effects analysis at a scale that was relevant to our concerns, at a scale of say, ceded territories. And it was essentially a GIS-based format that would take advantage and leverage as much existing information as possible. It wouldn't require a lot of new data. It would be a way for the lead agencies in a project like PolyMet to actually, for the first time, do a cumulative effects analysis that addressed the concerns that the bands were bringing forward. And when we became engaged in the environmental review process, not just for PolyMet, but for these other mining projects as well, the direction I was getting from tribal leadership was to focus on the regulatory process. This was not about trying to shut down or curtail an industry. It was about trying to do everything we could within our power to protect our way of life, to protect the resources that support our way of life. And so at every step of the way, the kinds of comments that we were making, the kinds of critical analyses that we were doing around impacts were about trying to make this industry follow the rules. We figured that if the permitting agencies were going to allow a project to go forward and it could meet water quality standards, that they could minimize their impacts and mitigate for what they couldn't minimize, that was something that we would deal with. And so that was the direction that I was getting, that my colleagues that were working for other tribal agencies and governments were getting. We were expecting that the state and federal agencies were upholding their regulatory frameworks and their authorities, both in the environmental review and in the issuance of permits. And we had a lot of faith that water quality standards should play an important role. We were always advocating for more data, better understanding, more transparency, a clearer picture that everybody could understand, a common basis for understanding what the impacts may be. And we wanted to make sure that any project moving forward would be compliant with our water quality standards. So as the GIS, the environmental review process began for PolyMet, we were already engaging with the Corps at that time and expressing a lot of interest. We actually requested face-to-face that we be invited to be a cooperating agency. Months went by, the scoping process began. That invitation was not forthcoming. It wasn't until our tribal chairwoman wrote a letter to the district commander, if I'm not mistaken, in May of 2007, that actually brought results in September of 2007 with a direct invitation to Fond du Lac, Bois Forte, and Grand Portage to be cooperating agencies. Now, this is something under NEPA that should have been forthcoming immediately, particularly once the bands expressed an interest in participating at that level. To be at the seat, in on the review of all of the technical support documents, the drafting of chapters, the analysis of impacts, to be able to bring our expertise into the picture, and to be able to review and comment on early drafts before they were released to the public. So we were already kind of behind the 8 ball when that letter inviting us as cooperating agencies came. In fact, the scoping was pretty well done at that point. But we were offered some limited participation in some of the working groups. Some of the comments we got from core leadership at that time was an assumption or presumption that really we only had expertise in cultural resources. And as I mentioned before, and as Tom laid out, the band considers natural resources to be cultural resources. They are integral to the maintaining of the Ojibwe culture and traditional lifeways. And at this point, we all had staff that are trained, that are experienced, that have strong scientific backgrounds and a strong connection to the community to understand what those concerns would be. We were immediately able to identify what we thought were some pretty significant data gaps in some of the preliminary analyses that were happening. Things like a real paltry amount of water chemistry data, the hydrologic data that was being relied upon for the water quality and hydrologic modeling was it was 20 years old and taken from a gauge that was about 16 miles downstream of the project. So really not relevant to current conditions, certainly not taking into account climate change impacts and an understanding of what existing hydrologic conditions were. And there was a clear intent to really spatially and temporally limit the analysis of cumulative effects. So the tribal response, Fond du Lac staff, as well as the other agencies that I mentioned, was being able to review the technical documents, to understand what was going into the drafting of the chapters for the EIS, and we provided substantive comments along the way on some of our own analyses, and certainly the comments that we provided were scientifically supported and well cited. We hosted a training for all of the permitting and environmental review agencies. We brought in EPA's National Hard Rock Mining team, Steve Hoffman and Jim Kuipers, to walk through what would a sufficient financial assurance package for the state of Minnesota's first ever copper nickel sulfide mine look like. And what do you need to be really thinking about? There was a brand new set of regs on the book, but the state of Minnesota had never permitted a sulfide mine before. And so it was an attempt to make sure that everybody was on the same page and had a clear understanding of what we needed to know to protect the public's interest, not just the band's interest, but how the state and federal agencies could make sure that if this project moved forward and was permitted and operated, that we wouldn't be left holding the bag for cleanup down the road. We sought some external expert review of some of the early documents as well, particularly the hydrologic model, and we went to USGS. From our perspective, they're the gold standard when it comes to environmental data, particular hydrologic data and water quality data. And we talked to people in both the Minnesota and Wisconsin water science centers. And USGS is notoriously shy about getting involved in anything that might be perceived as political. Their intent was not to try to sway a decision. It was an attempt to make sure that there was a clear and common understanding of the science. And in fact, they brought forward some really strong recommendations for how the model could be improved, how it could be clarified, so that everybody, including the public who was going to review it, could have a common understanding of what was being put forward. And finally, we really tried to persuade the co-lead agencies, the Minnesota DNR and the Army Corps at this time, to follow that cumulative effects analysis protocol that EPA had helped us develop. The state of Minnesota was not interested. It was just guidance as far as they were concerned. And disappointingly, the Corps decided that they didn't think that it was appropriate to follow that protocol. We elevated our concerns about mercury impacts from this project from the very beginning. We had, at that point, a fair amount of our own water quality data. We had been collecting fish from reservation waters for a number of years. We had been working with the state agencies, Department of Health, PCA, DNR, in trying to understand mercury impacts in this watershed. And what we were seeing in terms of the analysis of mercury impacts for this project during the draft EIS phase was that it was completely deficient. It was not accurately representing existing conditions, never mind accurately projecting or predicting what the impacts and future conditions would be. We had to fight to get some of the technical documents. We knew when work products were underway. We would ask consistently and periodically to have access to them, but it was often, quite a bit of time after they were released to the other agencies when we were able to see them. So the draft EIS was published in 2009. We had collectively and individually for our agencies developed comments in addition to what we had been providing all along through the environmental review process. And we actually had to invoke dispute resolution under the MOA that we had signed with the Corps to be a cooperating agency, because rather than following NEPA guidelines and presenting our dissenting opinions or our alternative analyses alongside what the co-lead agencies were providing, we were relegated to footnotes. We were asked to quickly cobble together a set of unified comments that could be inserted as footnotes to the draft DIS. I cannot tell you how discouraging and demeaning it was to have several years of work treated in that fashion, but it was just as gratifying then when EPA came out with a determination that that draft DIS was getting the lowest possible rating, EU3, meaning that it was both inadequate from a NEPA standpoint in terms of how it went about doing the analyses, and the environmental impacts were unsatisfactory, and this project should not move forward as it has been defined in the draft DIS. And one of the key issues that they identified in their comments on their decision document was that it failed to take into account the impacts to downstream water quality standards and water resources of the band. So when it became apparent that we were going to have to go back to the drawing board and do a supplemental EIS, we were hopeful. We were hopeful that that would lead to more engagement, more involvement, more listening, perhaps, more consideration. We started off with a field visit to the site to get a common understanding of the extent of the wetland resources up there and a better understanding of the hydrologic connection to groundwater. And it was a good start, a promising start. Now, because it was clear that the land exchange was a connected action, Superior National Forest became another federal co-lead agency. And because EPA had rated this an EU3, essentially gave it a failing grade, they felt compelled, obligated to step in and be a part of the process during the supplemental EIS to help steer it in a direction to where it could pass muster and go on towards permitting. We again requested to be integrated with the technical work groups in the different media areas. And more importantly, we requested responsiveness. We didn't want to be just dismissed out of hand without any explanation as to why our well-reasoned and well-supported comments and recommendations were not even being addressed in the draft chapters. At that time, the Corps expressed a lot of interest in a better understanding of what we meant when we talked about our downstream water quality standards. And obviously, EPA had called it out in their earlier rating of the draft DIS. And specifically, I was asked on 2 occasions with written communications from Tamara Cameron to lay out the details about how we promulgated our standards and how we implement those standards to better understand how they should probably be considered in the supplemental draft DIS. And, we laid out our concerns around mercury, and we were also really clear about our concerns for specific conductants. At this time, we were looking at potentially establishing a hatchery. I think that's still on the dream list, so that we don't have to go over to the Upper Peninsula to get stock. But we needed to understand what kind of conditions were needed to be able to do that sort of investment in restocking. And we were seeing that early life stages, the eggs, the larval fish, the really young ones were sensitive to high salinity. And so if we were going to try to raise fish, we needed to be able to provide the kind of water quality that would support them. And at that time, we were considering a specific conductance standard, but we had not yet promulgated that. But we communicated it clearly that it was something that we were investigating. And as Tom pointed out, there has been a huge investment for the last 20 years on behalf of the Fond du Lac Band to reestablish a sustainable population of lake sturgeon in this stretch of the river. The state agencies have invested for more than 30 years to try to reestablish them down in the estuary, and the tribal agencies have certainly been a part of supporting that, helping to track their success. In fact, our fisheries biologist was the first one to find the first promising beginnings of natural reproduction down in the estuary. We're hoping to see the same thing happen up on this stretch of the river. But we have to make sure that we're providing the right kind of habitat and the right kind of water quality to support that effort. We have measured specific conductance on every monitoring trip that we have ever done for any lake, stream, river, even in our wetlands. It's easy, cheap to measure, and it's a really nice parameter that gives you a lot of information. And so across the board, across all of our water bodies, we are always in really low numbers. 100 to 200 microsiemens per centimeter is pretty typical. We've got some really soft waters that are even lower than that. On the St. Louis River, however, it's a different story. And it's because of that river connection. We are hydrologically connected to what is happening up in the headwaters. And we have just, snapshot kind of data taken at a discrete sampling event going back probably 15 years or more on the St. Louis River. But last year, we installed continuous specific conductance sensors in 3 of our 5 river sites. Last year, if you recall, we had a pretty extreme drought. And by the end of the summer, we were down to maybe some of the lowest base flow that I have seen in the St. Louis River and across all of our waters. And so here at River Mile 53, which is west of Brookston, it's our most upstream monitoring site on the St. Louis River. You can see that from, what are the dates here? All the way from September into late October, that we are exceeding that water quality standard that was finally approved in 2020, 100% of the time. Now, mind you, this is a chronic standard, and how it would be implemented would be an annual average, right? But this gives you a sense of how we are able to measure upstream water chemistry inputs 79 miles downstream of where they may have originated. And it makes sense because if you look at our next downstream site, which is at the Highway 2 bridge, it's still exceeding our standard, but not by quite as much. The Cloquet River has come in at this point and is diluting it. And then if you go further downstream, right around the place Tom said he learned how to fish on the river, it's still elevated, but it's kind of hovering right around our new chronic specific conductance criterion. So this is just some raw data. We happen to have it available, and I wanted to include it in this presentation because I think there's been a lot of people scoffing at the idea that water quality impacts from up on the Iron Range are impacting or detectable as far downstream as our waters. Unfortunately, our high hopes about a better process with the supplemental draft EIS did not come to pass. There was still, from our perspective, grossly inadequate data that the analyses were based upon. There was still a black box around the hydrologic and water quality modeling, and not understanding how those predictions were calculated makes it hard to have a lot of confidence in the output. We constantly raised concerns about the methodology employed to understand indirect wetland impacts. There were many other ways that it could have been done more accurately, and in a way that would be much more informative to the permitting process, so that everybody understands that this isn't just going to impact the 900 plus acres that are going to disappear. It is going to have profound impacts radiating out because of the changes in hydrology. And there are ways to measure that go beyond the way that was employed in the supplemental draft EIS. We constantly suggested that more attention should be paid to how impacts could be minimized if an underground mining project were to be developed. And in fact, we have every reason to believe that if this project does move forward, that this 20-year mine plan that was permitted is just the beginning, and that there's likely a lot more reserves at depth, higher quality reserves at depth, that would probably be next up for exploitation. There was a really, really simplified approach to understanding and predicting mercury impacts. I'm going to leave it to Brian, our mercury expert, to go into detail about that, but suffice to say that our comments that were submitted on the draft EIS were detailed and extensive and heavily cited, and were the foundation on which we built our will effect determination. There was really a narrow view of climate change impacts. I mean, all of the things that we had talked about during those meetings with the co-lead agencies, where we were hoping to get clarity on how our input was being considered or not, and why. It still ended up in a place where there was a deficient cumulative effects analysis and climate change analysis. The socioeconomic analysis was really focused only on what kind of jobs, what kind of an impact is this going to have on the labor economy of this region? And it completely failed to take into account what a healthy, intact environment would provide in terms of economic and environmental services. We felt it was really a narrow and very biased approach. Yeah, what we ended up calling those civ list meetings with the co-lead agencies felt like, at the end of the process, just a way for them to check the box, to make a big Gantt chart and say, okay, we talked about wildlife, and we talked about cumulative effects, and we talked about climate change. We're going to move on, without any real resolution, without any real consideration or incorporation of the perspectives that we brought to the table. So when we saw what was happening, that our positions, our perspectives were really not being reflected, we began to conduct our own studies. And mind you, this is prior to the SDEIS being published. We did our own attempt at a hydrologic model, and did some training with EPA, but under the tutelage of USGS. We did our own analysis of indirect wetland impacts, wild rice impacts, and a cumulative effects analysis. Yeah, sure, thanks. And I will just hit a couple of those just for reference. This is an example of some work that Esteban did, and you may see more from him about this a little bit later. An understanding of where wetlands were actually delineated and where there were potential impacts and the massive gap in information between what was accounted for in the analysis and what was not. We looked at a different approach for understanding drawdown and what that might mean for the wetlands and the expanded area of influence with the amount of bedrock drawdown that would likely be occurring. And what that would mean in terms of the shift in wetland type and function if there was as much drawdown as we anticipated and the impacts were what we were professing they would be. These are really unique systems, and they require a very specific set of climate and hydrologic factors to persist, and they take centuries to be created. And over the course of the 20-year mine plan, we were truly concerned about how many thousands of acres of this kind of wetland would be degraded or diminished. Essentially, this whole area in the upper Partridge River watershed where the PolyMet Mine site occurs, this headwaters of the Partridge River, it's also part of a feature that is known on the USGS maps as the 100-mile swamp. It's a large area of really high quality, intact, undisturbed peatlands and wetlands and open water areas. And what we were predicting would be likely to happen because of the proximity of the PolyMet mine pit to the existing North Shore Peter Mitchell mine pit, which, by the way, had already been permitted for an expansion. If both of them were going to dewater to the extent that they were being permitted to dewater or projected, it could essentially dry out the entire headwaters of the Partridge River watershed. We had serious concerns about what was being projected in terms of the ability to control highly polluted groundwater seepage from the tailings basin. Mind you, this is a former taconite tailings basin that PolyMet was going to reuse for their tailings. And so they were going to build it up another several hundred feet. And right now, the existing conditions are such that the polluted water from the former LTV processing has already impacted the Embarrass River watershed. It is continuing to do so, and piling more tailings on top of those tailings is not going to cause the problem to disappear. So eventually the project was proposing to capture that seepage by putting essentially a series of dewatering wells and keying in some sheet piling to the bedrock below. And where we have seen that implemented around this region, it is certainly not capturing 100% of the seepage. At best, it's capturing somewhere between 50 and 60%. So a lot of what this project ultimately was permitted to do based upon this environmental review, we have clear evidence that there's no way that this project can perform the way that it has been predicted to perform on a whole host of levels. We were constantly trying to persuade the permitting agencies that existing wild rice waters in the Embarrass River watershed and the Partridge River watershed needed to be protected. In other words, the sulfate standard needed to be implemented at places where PolyMet's discharge would reach known stands of wild rice. And these were documented stands that the project proponents' own contractors provided the data on. And they really, the MPCA was really only thinking about applying it at a few very discrete locations as opposed to all of the places where it actually occurred. We did our own cumulative effects analysis. And I think I am going to leave this and pick up with my last few comments about permitting and the final EIS for after we get back from lunch. So thank you for your patience.
All right, thanks, Vanessa, Thomas, and Nancy. So we'll go ahead and recess for Lisa.